Welcome back to part 2 of our mini-series on opposition to the Vietnam War in the US. If you haven't listened to part 1, I would go back and listen to that first. As a content note, this episode contains mention of sexual violence. While nowadays many people believe myths about soldiers being spat on, etc., in fact, building solidarity with US service personnel was a central part of the anti-war movement. Cora Weiss explains more about how this happened in the US mainland.
Well, there was an organization called USSF, United States Servicemen's Fund, I think. And I don't have files and notes in front of me. There was a campaign to send entertainers to the bases in the United States where they were training. And the entertainers were, of course, all anti-war people, and they would sing songs against the war. I Ain't Marching Anymore by Phil Oakes, for example. So that was one thing that happened. They were sent to coffee houses, that's what it was. They established coffee houses at the bases where soldiers could come and learn about the war and be entertained by mostly folk musicians.
Our podcast episodes 10 and 11 are about the resistance to the war in the military itself, where we also go into more detail about the spitting myths. In the bonus audio to this episode for our Patreon supporters, we also include an interview with another Vietnam veteran, Leland Nobinsky, of the 101st Airborne Division, about his experiences of anti-war activism. As Vivian explains, there were a myriad of other tactics used to oppose the war.
You know, every church had a peace committee. There were vigils against the war everywhere. There was a whole campaign. The government, because they couldn't get the Congress to allocate money for this war, because there was no consensus about the war in Congress, Johnson imposed a telephone tax. And the tax would go to the war in Vietnam. And so there were local campaigns all over the country not to pay your telephone tax. And the telephone company didn't want to shut off your telephones because they wanted the business. And the government threatened to take people to court and throw them in prison for not paying their telephone tax. But I don't think it happened to anybody. There were all kinds of resistance. People were very creative, so there was protest everywhere, demonstrations all the time, different kinds of groups and creative actions, just like there are now.
The Johnson administration introduced a 10% phone tax in 1966, initially for 2 years, but it was extended afterwards, specifically to pay for the war.
I noticed that the demonstrations seemed not to be enough, and not only not to be enough, but some aspects of it might be harmful to the cause of peace, since the anti-war movement didn't have King's philosophy. I mean, some of it did, some of it didn't. And people were just hostile, they were panicked, people were worried about their own being drafted. That's normal enough and fine. Speaking derisively of the government and so on, just out of frustration, not being able to stop this terrible thing. I started refusing parts of my federal taxes, the part that was added on to our phone bills. There was a federal excise tax on our phone bills that almost went out of existence, but in the debates in the U.S. Congress, somebody mentioned that the war requires us to maintain this small tax. It went into the U.S. budget, but in this debate, one of the senators said that the war is the only reason that we need to maintain this. So that was another aspect. So I began to be a legal disobedient to war in 1966, refusing that tax and explaining to the phone company that I was paying their parts of it and just wasn't paying the tax. This was an organized effort also, and I still have some connection with the war tax resistance movement.
Resistance to the tax began almost as soon as it was introduced, and soon spread across the country. In 1970, the tax was extended further, but to be decreased by 1% per year, until eventually disappearing entirely. By 1972, it's estimated that 500,000 people were refusing to pay the tax. One of the most important aspects of the anti-war movement was resistance to the draft. To start off with, I think it's worth explaining a bit about how the draft worked. All US men aged 18 to 25 had to register for selective service, and still do today in fact. This makes them eligible for the draft at any point. There was never actually a declaration of war on North Vietnam, so the draft occurred entirely during, quote, peacetime. The draft had actually been pretty much in continuous use since World War II, but after the end of the Korean War in 1953, numbers were generally pretty low, and most people who were drafted did their service unquestioningly. But with President Lyndon B. Johnson mobilising ground troops, numbers being drafted rocketed. Between 1965 and 1969, an average of 300,000 men a year were drafted. In these first 4 years, the Selective Service chose who got drafted and who didn't, and while they didn't have information on the socio-economic status or race of individuals, the draft was highly discriminatory, largely because of deferments. So, depending on your occupation or your health, certain people could be excused from the draft at a given point in time. Occupational deferments were allocated predominantly to college students and people working in professional occupations like engineers, scientists, teachers, and doctors. Potential draftees were also given very brief checkups by military doctors, and these were very unlikely to result in any health conditions which would have allowed an exemption to be detected. Whereas for the wealthy, they could afford to pay for private doctors who could potentially diagnose any number of conditions, then provide a report on that which could be passed to the military doctors. So to see how that worked in practice, a couple of examples would be the current Republican President Donald Trump. He got 4 deferments for college, then a medical deferment after a private doctor diagnosed him with bone spurs, which didn't previously prevent him from taking part in sports. Similarly, presumptive Democratic nominee for the forthcoming 2020 presidential election Joe Biden also got 4 college deferments, before also getting a medical deferment for supposedly having asthma as a teenager, which again didn't prevent him from playing sports at the time or working as a lifeguard. All of this meant that those drafted were disproportionately people of colour, particularly African Americans, and also they were overwhelmingly working class. Various tactics began to be used to try to resist the draft.
It was extremely voluntary. I mean, men, because it was only a male draft, men wanted to not go to Vietnam. And it didn't require any of us to encourage them. They were lining up. And some of them went to Sweden and some went to Canada to escape the draft. Some claimed that their hands hurt when they held a gun, and they used medical excuses that they got their doctors to send affidavits about. I did draft counseling inside the Riverside Church, where people could come and learn what the draft was all about and how to not get into it, drafted. 2 of us ran a draft counseling center out of our peace office at the famous Riverside Church in New York.
Eventually, resistance and anger over the clear unfairness of the draft caused the government to switch to a lottery in 1969. So that worked as following. Every day of the year would be allocated a number from 1 to 366 by putting the date on 366 plastic balls in a glass container and drawing them one at a time. The first ball drawn was the 14th of September, so that was number 1. The second date drawn was allocated the number 2, all the way up to 366. So anyone born on September the 14th between 1944 and 1950 would be the first to be drafted, and so on. This slightly less unfair system didn't stop the resistance.
Yeah, there were. This was before the draft was eliminated. The government eliminated the draft partly because it was a political issue, but they went into this lottery system. But so during the draft, there were people who got deferments. College students got deferments, and people who had little children. And then there was the conscientious objector status. So my husband at the time became a conscientious objector. A lot of people did. It depended where their draft board was. His draft board was in New York, so it was possible, but people who had draft boards in more conservative areas had no chance to be conscientious objectors. People fled to Canada to get out of the draft, and then I knew a number of more working class young people who were put into prison for draft evasion. And they did it to make a political statement. But it was very difficult. Their wives often had kids and had to go live with their parents or their in-laws who were very critical. I was a community organizer at the time in the western suburbs of Chicago, which were kind of working class white suburbs, and I worked with a number of young people whose husbands were resisting the draft. And then we knew that when the draft was eliminated, and even actually when there still was a draft, poor people and people of color did not get deferments. Most of them were not in college. They didn't have the resources to go through the CO, conscientious objector process. They certainly didn't want to go to prison. And increasingly, the armed forces in Vietnam were men of color, poor men of color. So the burden of the war was not equally being carried in the United States. It was being carried by poor communities in a really disproportionate way. And so it became a civil rights issue. It united the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And, you know, shortly before Martin Luther King was killed, he united those issues. And I think that's one of the reasons he was seen as so dangerous by the political establishment. He united those movements. So it was a race issue, it was an economic issue, it was an issue of democracy, and it was a human rights issue because of what was happening to the Vietnamese. And so it became extremely intense, and a lot of Americans, myself included, I felt haunted and implicated in the war. I felt, it was partly our fault. We need to figure out how to end it. And then some people got kind of crazy and thought they could just commit acts of violence and that was going to end the war. But the Vietnamese always said to us, you need to convince the American people. They used to say, if the American people knew the truth about Vietnam, they would oppose the war. You need to tell them what is going on here. And they didn't believe in acts of sabotage or anything like that. They wanted the U.S. out and, acts of sabotage in the United States. They really wanted us to get a majoritarian peace movement. Yeah, so we really felt responsibility. And that responsibility drove some people crazy.
Others burned their draft cards in public displays of defiance. Still others, like legendary boxer Muhammad Ali, chose to be sent to prison rather than join the military. An estimated 40,000 people fled to Canada, with maybe 60,000 going to other countries. And up to 570,000 people in total ended up avoiding the draft in one way or another. Many others, especially those with low lottery numbers, decided to voluntarily enlist in the military so they could at least choose where and how they served, like Bart, who we spoke to in our episode 11, who joined the Navy. While some anti-war activists like Vivian didn't approve of acts of violence, as with social movements today, they began to receive more media coverage when violence occurred.
We got a lot of press then. There was a story about me in the New York Post. There were short stories about women protesting because it was unusual. It was sort of the first time. It was a movement that began out of the civil rights movement. I mean, there was a cascade of movements from the 50s forward to the present day, and one sort of rolled into the next, and then from our movement to the women's movement and so forth. So we got some press, and we were on radio programs. I had my own radio program. I think I was the only woman or one of two women who anchored a radio program in New York on the dial. I think the press came when the demonstrations escalated, and they were always looking for violence or turbulence, which was unfortunate.
Another way that activists sought to mobilize opposition to the war was by trying to undermine official narratives about the conflict.
Well, there was the official line about what was going on in Vietnam, and there was very little information about what actually was going on in Vietnam. So it became really important, and there was a lot of distrust for the official government line. For one thing, it was never a declared war. Congress was never asked to vote to support the war. It was always an undeclared war. So it was a war that was initiated really by the political establishment in Washington and sustained by them. And we had this draft. So all of us had friends who were getting drafted into the war. People didn't want to go to Vietnam. There was a lot of consciousness about the level of poverty that we had in our country, and the amount of money that was going into the Vietnam War was enormous. And people were getting drafted into something they didn't know anything about and didn't really support. So there was that part of it. And then the Vietnamese made a conscious decision to try to have face-to-face contact with Americans to tell their side of the story. And I personally think that that was an extremely powerful way to get a message out. And the message was a completely different message than the message that was being distributed by the military and the political leadership. And basically the message from the Vietnamese, that what we learned is that this was a country that was fiercely independent, that did not want to be dominated by any outside power, that was not run by Russia or run by China, that they were independent. They had a history of fighting for their rights going back centuries. They defeated the French, and they were going to fight to the end to get rid of the Americans, that they wanted to run their own country. And, the message from Washington was that Vietnam was a tool in the communist domination of Southeast Asia. It was just another domino in this domino theory that the communists were going to take over the world. And they were being run by the Russians and the Chinese. Not true. They had their own leaders. They had their own philosophy. They had their own history. And that it was a people's war, that the entire population, particularly North Vietnam, was mobilized against the United States and to survive the bombing of North Vietnam. So I had the opportunity to go on this delegation for 17 days to North Vietnam and see the kind of weapons. Our government said we don't use napalm, we don't use anti-personnel weapons, we're only destroying military targets. We saw hospitals and schools and people covered in anti-personnel pellets from these anti-personnel weapons that were exploded all over the countryside. We saw how people were defending themselves with rifles against B-52 bombers. It was really not just a people's war, but a poor people's war against the biggest military power in the world at the time. So there was a counter message from our point of view, which is that these are people just like us, and they believe in independence, and they're not going to stop fighting because they're fighting for their country. They're not fighting for some communist leader. They're fighting for themselves. And then there were, of course, journalists that were there starting to understand that message and the depths of opposition to United States involvement. And then there were our soldiers who found themselves killing women and children in little villages. And I think the combination of that information slowly started to get out. Anybody who had any contact with the Vietnamese felt just an enormous responsibility to do whatever we could to end the war and to convince other people that the war was wrong. So I felt Well, for one thing, I had to borrow $1,200 to go, so I had to pay it back. And so the way I paid it back was in increments of $25, and I spoke anywhere, to any church, any school, any organization. I felt that I needed to. I took an anti-personnel weapon that I was given. It no longer had explosives in it, to show Americans what our tax dollars were paying for. I told them the stories I heard. I brought photographs, and I spoke hundreds of times all around the Midwest. And there were other people doing the same thing. I also had a tape that a Vietnamese woman made. It was a message to American women, and I played that hundreds of times, where she talked about the impact of the war on women and children. And there were, many other people like me, not many, but there were other people like me who had this opportunity and felt this responsibility to bring the human side of the war to other Americans.
The tape that Vivian refers to there was recorded by Mrs. Van of the Vietnamese Women's Union. We include it in its entirety in our episode 14. Cora too learned a lot from the stories of Vietnamese women.
I went to Vietnam 4, 5, 6 times, most during the bombing and 1 or 2 after the war was over. And I met remarkable families who survived horrific moments. I met with young women and older women who were survivors of the My Lai massacre, and I had to sit and listen to them and tell their story, and I couldn't hold it. It was unbearable. And I still can see the ditch in my mind's eye as I'm telling you the story. So that was a huge moment.
The South Vietnamese village of My Lai in 1968 was the location of the most notorious massacre by US forces, in which 300 unarmed civilians, including elderly people, women and small children, were brutally murdered by bayonet and gunshot, some of them being raped beforehand. A number of villagers were made to get into a ditch, then machine-gunned. News of the massacre was eventually broken by a Vietnam vet, Ron Ridenour, who learned of it from a colleague who was there and told journalist Seymour Hersh. Back in the US in 1967, Cora and her fellow activists began to try to make connections with other movements.
One of the splinters that we had from Women's Strike for Peace, there were several during the course of the history, was to form a new organization named for Jeanette Rankin, who was the first woman member of Congress. And she was a pacifist. None of us were ideological pacifists, even though we were opposed to unjust wars. But she voted against World War I, which is okay. But she also voted against World War II, which was not okay with us. But on everything else, she was absolutely terrific. She was a peace activist. And a group of women from Women's Strike for Peace, Amy Swerdlow, Judy Lerner, Ethel Taylor, a considerable group, decided that we had to be more inclusive in our work, which was code for there should be African Americans and younger people and people from the religious communities, faith groups. So we reached out and created this Jeanette Rankin Brigade, and African American women came along, Coretta King and others, Maxine Waters, and the women who were leaders of the women's groups within the Methodists and the Loretta Sisters and a Protestant group and a Jewish religious group. And the Jeanette Rankin Brigade's slogans were end poverty and racism at home and the war in Vietnam. So we joined the poverty and race issue with the war issue. which we should have done from the beginning, but it never happened. It was important, it was significant, it was the right thing to do. And unfortunately, it wasn't sustained. Sustainability is a very important issue when you're organizing, and especially sustainable peace, meaning a sustainable peace movement too. And inclusivity is very important, and we're learning all of that now when it's time for new movements, like the movement to abolish nuclear weapons, the movement to oppose climate change, to stop climate change, which should be merged also and aren't yet, because they both have the same consequence of apocalyptic consequence. So you learn from experience, I guess. One movement cascades into another, and new strategies emerge. So the Jeanette Rankin Brigade was a good thing that happened that was important, and it was short-lived. But we all were enriched by it. It was very important to me and to us. And we made new friends, which was the best part, I guess. Many of them who became my friends forever, right, until they no longer were around.
As happens with many social movements, despite much of the organising work being done by women, leaderships of official organisations were mostly male, and there were many instances of sexist and misogynist behaviour.
There was clearly male dominance of everything. I was one woman out of 4 co-chairs of the mobilization to end the war in Vietnam, which was the 1969 demonstration in Washington. And they got used to having me around. But me means one person, and there were not a lot. We had the leadership of Women's Strike was always together and working together, and the membership, not just leadership. We were not very hierarchical.
Vivian found that in Vietnam there was a big contrast with the US in terms of the roles being played by women in the liberation movement. As a content note, there is some description of sexual violence in the next clip, so if you'd rather not hear that, you can skip forwards about 90 seconds.
When I was in the South, most of the grassroots leaders of the Mississippi Freedom Movement were women, like Fannie Lou Hamer. There were a number of women. And it was the first time I really saw women in political leadership. And it was very inspiring. And then when we met with the Vietnamese, there were, I don't know if it was half women in the Vietnamese delegations, but it was close. And they talked a lot about the impact of the war on women and children, and then about the leadership of women. And also about the importance of American women speaking up against the war because of the concerns and the credibility that women would have in the public debate. So this was a very important message for me and other women. First of all, in Bratislava at the conference that we went to, the Vietnamese women asked to meet separately with the American women, which was only the second time I'd ever been in a political environment where women met separately, because they felt like they had a message and they had information that we would care deeply about, probably more than men, and also they wanted to promote our leadership and our commitment to reaching other women and other Americans. So that was a big deal. That they felt like we were important to them and important organizers. I never thought of myself as an organizer of women before. And so they kind of elevated our sense of strategic importance. And they would talk about the sexual brutality of American soldiers against Vietnamese women, how Vietnamese prostitutes were parachuted onto GI bases, and how soldiers put rifle butts up women's vaginas and hand grenades and just horrible brutality that I don't think they wanted to talk about in a mixed environment. And then they also talked about what they called the long-haired army, which was women in villages, when they knew American soldiers were coming, would gather and try to go out to them and beg them not to destroy their village. And then they talked about Vietnamese women in the armed forces, including women who were nursing babies, who were part of local guerrilla units. And they told us about the Vietnamese Women's Union, which was an organization that helped women with childcare, with health education, and also promoted them as leaders in the village, in the provincial level, and then in the Politburo, their national political structure, which had women representing the Women's Union in it. So they saw themselves as playing this role and the role of reaching women internationally, because they felt women were just very effective peace organizers. It was stunning.
Black women in the US also played a central role in the movement against the war, as well as the black liberation struggle in general, as Amali Yeshitela explains.
I think that's really, really important. It's one of the least respected and understood factors in the struggle. The African People's Socialist Party and our predecessors, the precursors, we've always had women leaders, not just symbolic, not just, one woman, one man kind of symbolic thing, but actual leaders. In fact, there were some nationalist groups who used to refer to us at the time. I had a colonial name of Joe Waller. They used to refer to as Joe Waller and the girls, and meaning, that's the influence of the African women in our party, in our movement. But the women have always been extraordinarily heroic, and not just heroic, but in perhaps every instance, the least liberal, most demanding, fiercest fighters in our movement. I mean, that's just been the way it is. And there used to be a saying that the men were the jawbone and the women were the backbone. And increasingly what we find today is women determined to be both the jawbone and the backbone. So, but women played magnificent, heroic roles in this whole struggle, this entire movement. And I don't just mean people like Ella Baker, who was a fierce anti-imperialist and somebody I loved very much. And I don't mean just people like Fannie Lou Hamer. These are people who the whole world has come to know, but there were other women, everywhere, SNCC women and others, who were part of this movement on the grassroots level and what have you. So, yeah, the women were profoundly significant, profoundly important in the struggle. And as I said, the ones who were least liberal than anybody and just filled with determination. And, there's this whole thing that comes from some nationalists about how the women are the ones who, provide the culture and teach the children. But these women were fighters. And that's how that's been historically in the struggle. And even when we were confronting like what was happening in the war, in fact, many women in our movement were learning from the women in Vietnam. They were learning how the women in Vietnam were engaged in struggle on the battlefield, but also how women in Vietnam were engaged in struggle against male backwardness in Vietnam at this very crucial moment in history. So the women played incredibly important roles.
Participation in the struggles had a transformative impact on many of the women involved.
My favorite little anecdote is that a friend of mine who was a leader in SDS, a guy, said to my husband at the time, my God, Vivian has completely changed. This trip to Vietnam has completely changed who she is and what she thinks. And my husband at the time said to him, "That's not true. You just never listened to her before," which was absolutely true. So I had opportunities to speak publicly that I had never really spoken publicly before. And I spoke at meetings. I spoke at rallies. I was interviewed by the press, stuff that never would have happened before and never did happen before. And it was a huge push on me to overcome my insecurities and be able to do this. And it was a push on other men. And frankly, there wasn't much of a place for women who had political experience and wanted to be leaders in the mixed left. And I came back and got very active in the women's liberation movement. I helped to start an organization called the Chicago Women's Liberation Union. And we decided, a group of friends of mine and I, we had learned how to be leaders and we had learned how to be organizers. And there really wasn't an organization on the left where we could exert that leadership. So using this model of the Vietnamese Women's Union, we decided to form a women's union of our own. And I did keep working against the war. There was a whole group in the Women's Union that was active against the war. But we also worked on other issues. We had a rape crisis line. We had a campaign for government-supported child care. There was a group that worked on abortion rights, and we had actually an abortion service that was run by women in Chicago that actually did 11,000 abortions over the time that while abortions were still illegal. So we started doing what the Vietnamese Women's Union did, and probably still does. It offers services so women can survive, but it also supports women in leadership roles, and it tries to change policy. So that idea that you could organize a multifaceted women's organization that organized for political leadership, that was a really new idea. And so there were a few women's unions that developed across the Midwest. So that was very exciting. And we had hundreds of women coming to our activities. I was part of running a school called the Liberation School for Women, and we had hundreds of people coming to our classes. We had no idea how they even heard of us. There was no internet. We had these little mimeograph machines, and we'd pass out these leaflets. And there was just enormous interest.
That brings us to the end of part 2. In the bonus audio to this episode, we talked to Leland Lubinsky, who served in the 101st Airborne Division in Vietnam and was active in Vietnam Veterans Against the War. This is available to our Patreon supporters. Our Patreon supporters can listen to all remaining parts of this miniseries now, as well as 3 bonus episodes. For everyone else, subsequent parts will be out each week. You can listen and support us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. We have more info, further reading, photos, sources, links, and more on the webpage for this episode. Check it all out through the link in the show notes. Finally, thanks to all of our existing supporters on Patreon. This podcast is only possible because of your generosity. Thanks to Jesse French for editing this miniseries, and thanks to all of you for listening. Catch you next time.
Light a match, then in a flash, draft cards turned to ash. Thousands moved across the border, refusing military orders. Every army base in the USA had an anti-war cafe.